a problem I've been very concerned about since 2015 is that as American society has been getting more polarized, actually this began in the late 90s, as left and right have begun to hate each other more, institutions are getting pulled either to the right or to the left, and then they get purified. And in the academic world, it used to lean about 3 or 4 to 1 left-right, which is okay. Things don't have to be balanced, but you have to have someone on the other side to criticize ideas. Otherwise, you get weak, you get stupid, you endorse ideas just because everyone else does. And as John Stuart Mill taught us, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. So I've been very concerned that in higher ed, there are now essentially no conservatives in the social sciences, other than economics, where it's 3 or 4 to 1 left to right, which is okay, that'll function. But my field, psychology, it's 20 to 1. And I know the one guy, there's only one. So that's a problem for research. Okay, it gets even more serious when you get political passions and you get real anger at dissenters. And that's what happens in the academy. So if anyone were to produce, or if people do sometimes produce, findings that question the received narrative on transgender and detransitioning, or on gender or gendered choices about the workplace, or anything about race, I mean, there's all these topics where if your study doesn't support the prevailing narrative, you're going to have trouble getting it published. If you do have it published, you're going to have trouble getting tenure. And even if you have tenure, there could be a real reaction against you. Your article could be pulled. It's crazy what's happening in higher ed. And that's been happening intensely since 2015. So I co-founded Heterodox Academy, and Alana's been working with us closely. She's had all kinds of wonderful roles, written a lot of great essays, run events. So we've had this problem in higher ed intensely since 2015. And then it really began to spill out into the corporate world, beginning, I'd say, with the Google memo in 2017, but especially as Gen Z began to graduate. They were born in 1996 and later. They began graduating from college in 2018. So a lot of, and of course, the Trump presidency, understandably, really forced companies to take stands on political issues. So a lot of things really spread into the corporate world during the Trump presidency, and especially after 2018. So to come back to answer your question, in the business world, as in the academy, if you say, you know what, this isn't working, let's try something totally different, you're taking real risks with your career. In fact, the major reason why professors have gotten fired in the last 5 years is not that they said something racist. It's literally that they questioned a diversity policy. That's exactly what happened in the Google memo. He questioned whether implicit bias training works. Bang, you're gone. That's what happened with Brett Weinstein at Evergreen State College. He didn't say anything racist. He said, wait a second, this policy we're doing of whites off campus, I don't think this is the right policy. Bang, explosion. So it is taboo to question whether diversity policies work. And once you do that, basically, I'm writing an essay right now, the easy way to tell which side is wrong. And the answer is, it's the side that shoots its dissidents. If they do that, you can pretty much count on the fact that they're wrong.
I have a follow-up for John, because you've highlighted the need for empiricism in this, to go back to measuring the actual results of DEI. When it comes to a North Star, if you had to define some of the things that companies should be looking at and measuring in the future, what are some of those things that stand out to you as being those guides for us to know, is it working, is it producing good outcomes or not?
Well, so at Ethical Systems, which is a nonprofit that I co-founded to look at corporate culture and to bring research from the academic world into the study of corporate culture, we've developed a culture survey that looks at a number of different outcomes for ethical culture. One of the most important is procedural fairness. It's very important in any organization that people feel that the processes are fair and that I will have a chance to state my case, and that the processes that decide things are not corrupted. I will get a fair hearing. And a lot of work by Tom Tyler and others shows that when people perceive procedural fairness, they're much more willing to go along, even if the policy goes against them. So commit to strong perceptions of procedural fairness. The other kind of fairness is distributive fairness or distributive justice. And most people think that means you should get in proportion to what you give. But then there's a third category, which is now called equity, even though equity used to mean proportionality. Now equity means equality of outcome. And the only way to get equality of outcome is to violate procedural fairness. Mm-hmm. The only way, of course, you can give equal opportunity, but if you want to take a very diverse group that comes in at different levels of preparation, and especially on gender, you've got different interests in different roles, the only way you could get 50% female coders or engineers is going to be massive violations of procedural fairness. So I would urge companies to really focus on the perception of procedural fairness. Don't sacrifice that for anything. If you break that in pursuit of what you think is equity, you're going to have a lot of people thinking it's unfair. And it's not as though, oh, the white people will think it's unfair, but the black people will think it. Well, no, everybody wants procedural fairness. Everybody's uncomfortable by purely race-based promotion and admission. African Americans, whites, Hispanics, everybody.
Mm-hmm. Right. It does sort of speak to these broader questions about really about identity and sort of leaning into versus away from identity. And you're sort of making the point that, you know, yes, in order to elevate procedural fairness, which is what really is going to make a company function efficiently and harmoniously and all of these things, that there are limits as to how much you can lean into the identity, even though the identity groups matter and people, right? And so, but really sort of calibrating that in a way that doesn't violate the procedural fairness. It makes a lot of sense.
That's right.
I'm gonna throw something out there as an uncharacteristically optimistic statement, which is the following, that, you know, so I certainly shared John's concerns about higher education, and you know, I have chosen to believe, perhaps naively, that the problem in the corporate world may be slightly easier to address than in higher education. And so I'm curious, what?
Why is that?
Well, I could be totally wrong, but my sense is that, and that doesn't, saying it's easier than in higher education is not the same thing as saying it's easy. I don't mean to say that it's easy. I just mean that relatively speaking, it might be a little bit more manageable. And the reason I guess I would argue is just that it's, there's a profit, there's a bottom line. And so like there's an incentive in the corporate world that doesn't exist within higher education. Higher education, we can spend a lot of time, we can and do spend a lot of time talking out both sides of our mouths and trying to be all things to all people and not make any commitment that we're going to have to walk back. But at the end of the day, in the corporate world, there is a bottom line. And so and I'm mixing all kinds of metaphors here, but there's an incentive to sort of get all the ships pointed in the same direction that doesn't exist in higher education. And I wonder if that can be leveraged in a way, or maybe it doesn't even need to be leveraged. Maybe that's just the reality. And so that creates a different set of incentives. But tell me, Garrett, John, what do you think?
Yeah, Garrett, what do you think?
You have a lot of great research, and in one of your conversations, you referenced some of the early data that we pulled out in 2017 around viewpoint diversity in the tech industry, because the tech industry has really been on the bleeding edge of a lot of the DEI indoctrination, as I call it, over the past decade. And you know, I generally agree with Alana about the profit incentive being an important distinction between higher education and the corporate world. But some of the research that you highlight is that as millennials are moving from college campuses to corporate campuses, they're bringing a lot of the expectations and the culture from college campuses to the corporate environment, which could be blurring those lines. So I'm optimistic. I want to be positive in my outlook about the ability to have an impact in the corporate environment, because, you know, when you poll Americans and the institutions that they trust, I think DOD is number one and Amazon is number two. So corporations can have a outsized impact on culture and on society. So I'm optimistic, but your data suggests that we might be losing some ground.
That's right. I think there are reasons to think that the corporate world has certain advantages here and certain disadvantages. So Alana put her finger on the biggest one, which is that they actually care about what works. They want things to work. They don't want to waste money. So in the long run, they're very motivated to stop doing this. The other advantage they have is that the corporate world generally has a lot more viewpoint diversity. So there are certain industries such as journalism and media where almost everybody's on the left, and then you can get orthodoxies as we have in higher ed. But for the most part in the corporate world, if there's 10 people in there, you can't assume that they're all ardently progressive politically. So viewpoint diversity is a big benefit here. On the other hand, the corporate world is much more concerned about lawsuits than we are in higher ed. People are really walking on eggshells and doing anything to avoid triggering a lawsuit from an employee or some sort of class action suit. And they're also much more vulnerable to bad publicity. So in a sense, anyone who has an objection, anyone who gets angry can wreak a lot of damage via Twitter or Glassdoor, especially Twitter and other platforms. So in general, I'd say it's a wash as to which one. But here's where I think we can be hopeful. Several corporate leaders have said to me, if someone can invent a non-woke form of diversity training that actually works, we'd all go for it. And so if there's a good alternative that is actually empirically justified and it can be shown like, oh, look, this actually improves people's perception of belonging. It improves their perception that things are fair here. They can trust leadership. They don't feel that they're excluded because of their race or gender or anything else. So if there is a good alternative, then I think many businesses will beat a path to its door. They will want to use it. And then if it can be shown that it actually works, then I think we would see very quick adoption by many, many other businesses. Whereas in higher ed, I don't think that would happen.